past, present, and emerging, and the historic and ongoing contributions that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people make to the community sector. I would like to also acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded and that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Okay, just one more reminder for the people that have just joined, if you don't want your camera on, please turn it off now. This session will be recorded. Please also keep your mic muted while Scott is doing his presentation, and feel free to take it off when we have a Q&A. All right, thank you.
Great, thanks Leanne, and afternoon everyone. I would also like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people as the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today, and pay my respects to any other Indigenous people with traditional links to the city and the region. I'd like to acknowledge and respect their continuing culture and the contribution they make to the life of this city and the region. As Leanne mentioned, I'm the Acting Deputy Under Treasurer here at ACT Treasury. My team, part of my role is leading the production of the budget, and this presentation, I guess, follows on from one we did earlier this year. Some of you may have attended on how to read the budget papers. I don't know if this will go for the full hour. I'm hoping for lots of questions because otherwise it won't, but very high level sort of explanation of what the budget process is, and very timely actually as we move into the Assembly shortly voting on the appropriation bills. All right, so I might just start, and I guess where it all starts is in the legislation that governs the production of the budget and the budget process, and that's the Financial Management Act. And the purpose of a budget is basically to give the Assembly enough information to be able to vote on the appropriation bills. There are two appropriation bills presented in any one session, the General Appropriation Bill and also one for the Office of the Legislative Assembly. And the Financial Management Act is pretty clear on what the budget needs to contain. It needs to contain the budget for the overall territory for the year. It needs to include the proposed budget for each of the directorates or agencies. And it needs to have a consolidated set of financial statements. And if you read the budget outlook, I did have a copy with me, but they're available online. You'll see at the back of that, there is a section that has consolidated territory financial statements. They're produced according to accrual accounting. Old joke of a politician who misheard it as cruel accounting, but accrual accounting, which basically means that expenses, it's mainly expenses, but expenses and revenue are recorded for the economic impacts at the time they occur. So essentially something like a concessional loan with normal cash accounting standards. It looks very good because you collect the revenue from the concessional loan, but you don't account for the fact that actually you're making the loan at a discounted interest rate. So it tries to pick up those expense impacts. So if you look through those financial statements, it probably, if you're finding it hard to sleep, it's probably a recommended reading just before you go to bed because it'll put you to sleep very quickly. But it's a bunch of numbers that basically take you through the operating statement, the cash statement, and the balance sheet for the government agencies. So that sort of sets a background for what the budget process is. It's meant to be an information process that supports the Assembly and when they vote for the appropriation, which is the funding that all government agencies have to operate. Just going on to section 11 of the FMA, it talks about some other things that must be included as well. And I won't go through all of those, but you can see that in the various sections of the budget outlook, they'll be picked up. Things like a statement of risks. And I should say this is very a common thing to include in the budget. It's basically things that you may not know that will materialise. You might not even know what the financial impacts would be or other impacts might be if they do materialise. But it's a general statement saying the things we don't know, and these are the things that might provide a risk to the estimates that are contained in the budget. That's the other thing I should mention. If you read the budget outlook, it'll talk about what we expect to spend or what we expect to receive in revenue across the budget year, which in this case is 25-26, the one we're in at the moment, and the 3 forward years after that. So obviously with any sort of forecasting, you're not going to get it 100% right. So there's a fair bit of effort that goes into sort of making sure we get it as right as we can. A couple of other elements there. sensitivity analysis as well. What if, based on the fact that we can't perfectly forecast the future, what if we get it slightly wrong? What would that look like for the estimates? Sorry, the other thing I wanted to say as well, and this is important, is that second point there. The proposed budget may include anything else the Treasurer considers relevant. So it emphasises the point this is a government document. It's not a Treasury document. It gets cleared by the Treasurer. So all the statements in there, the descriptions around how the government's going to spend money, that is all from the government. Obviously, the Treasury itself, we put the numbers together, we verify the numbers, and we stand by them. But the narrative, effectively, it's a government document. Just moving on, what was a little bit different this year, we haven't had it for a few years, but a fiscal strategy. Some jurisdictions have these, which basically sets out the government's intentions to managing the budget, managing debt as well. And this was included in the budget outlook this year, and it goes through what the government's aims are across the next 4 years. So one is to return the budget to operating cash surpluses. So operating cash is basically a difference between, as the name suggests, what you have to pay out to run government versus the revenue received. And sometimes that's considered important by people because effectively, if you're running an operating cash surplus or it's in balance, you're really then only borrowing for capital, so infrastructure projects. So it's like, I guess, using your credit card for day-to-day expenses. That's okay if you've got a plan to repay it. So that's kind of what the fiscal strategy is picking up there. The other thing is that our metric, and we mentioned this in the previous session on how to read the budget papers, our metric for the budget deficit is the headline net operating balance. And that's basically revenue minus expenses. But in the ACT, we don't have our own defined benefit superannuation scheme, which other jurisdictions have. We have a liability to the Commonwealth. So under the Australian accounting standards, the capital gains and losses on the investments we make to pay off that liability aren't included in the net operating balance. So we add that back in, so we're comparable to those other jurisdictions. So I've got a slide a bit later that shows you the profile, but you probably remember the last financial year, the headline net operating balance was over $1 billion. This year, forecast to be about just over 400 million, and then going forward to return to surpluses in the out years. And I mentioned the unfunded defined benefit superannuation liability, and that again is sort of people in the ACT that were part of the Commonwealth scheme. It's a liability we owe to the Commonwealth. So that's the government's aim, I guess, the fiscal strategy. That's where they're trying to get to, managing debt, managing the deficit. In terms of the annual budget process, and this is absolutely, I've worked in the Commonwealth, so absolutely consistent with what happens in the Commonwealth. The budget process rules are the rules that government sets on itself, on its agencies, on its ministers, to go through the budget process and make decisions on spending and revenue. In the Commonwealth, they're called the budget process operational rules. So out of habit, I'm not like someone else called these are BPAWs, but budget process rules is what they're called in the ACT. They're endorsed by Cabinet and they set the basis for the coming budget. So the team here in Treasury is working on the budget process rules for next year's budget. So it sort of governs things like what is a proposal you need to bring forward through the budget process. It's typically defined as anything with a financial impact, or it might have future financial risks for the territory, or future financial impacts. Sometimes it's a bit hard to evaluate. You might, for example, have a plan in relation to a particular social issue, and you might say, well, that plan we can implement with existing resources, or it might be that after some consideration, it's something you're going to have to put more money into. So it's that sort of thing that the government needs to consider. And in addition, we have business cases that are considered through the budget process. I think in the most recent one, there's well over 200 that came through the process, and they essentially line up. If you look at the wellbeing chapter in the budget outlook, the initiative descriptions, each of those was a business case at some point that was considered by the Expenditure Review Committee of Cabinet. I think that's probably I want to say in that slide, and then moving down, I think we've sort of covered off on this. So basically, a budget proposal, it's a government decision that will have a financial impact. Obvious examples are, increasing grant funding to community organisations, extending a contract for out-of-home care providers, or could be extending funding for the multicultural festival. Anything like that is a decision of government, and that will be recorded as a initiative in the budget, so you can flick through and read that. The other thing that impacts on our revenue and expense estimates is what we call technical adjustments. So they're things that occur not specifically linked to a direct government decision, but occur because of, a change in indexation resulting from a change in inflation, or a change in payroll tax collection resulting from a rise in employment, something like that. So it follows on from the structure of the expense or the revenue, but it doesn't necessarily require a government decision to make it happen. And you'll see with the appropriation bills and the agency budget statements, there'll be bits of their new money, which is described as a initiative, and it'll have a title, and bits that is described as technical adjustments. And say it might be increasing the community sector indexation rate as a result of the Fair Work Commission decision on the SHADS award. That will flow through as a technical adjustment. I sort of flagged this a bit earlier, but the Expenditure Review Committee of Cabinet is the central decision-making for the body for the budget process. It's chaired by the Chief Minister and includes the Treasurer, the Finance Minister, and the Deputy Chief Minister. And interestingly, and maybe this reflects the fact that we're a small jurisdiction, all of those ministers have separate portfolio responsibilities as well. In the Commonwealth, I'm pretty sure the Treasurer is just the Treasurer. Minister for Finance in the Commonwealth is also the Minister for Public Service and the Minister for Women, but they're not typically line agencies or running big portfolios. So obviously, in the case of the Finance Minister here, Minister Stephen Smith, she's also Health Minister, and the Treasurer, Minister Steele, is also the Minister for Transport, amongst other things. Now, timing of budgets, that's obviously a decision of government. In recent years, it's been sort of late June, so coming towards the end of the financial year. In part, this reflects a need to make sure the budget's delivered after the Commonwealth delivers their budget on the first Tuesday of May, normally, not this year because they had the election, but normally to be on the first Tuesday of May. And the reason for that is that the Commonwealth budget will contain information on funding provided to the ACT, so it's important that we make sure our estimates are as up to date as possible. And so we typically follow the Commonwealth when they release their budget. So with that timeline in mind, and the other thing we have in the ACT is a mid-year budget update, similar to what the Commonwealth has. We call ours a budget review. It has to be delivered by the 15th of February every year. This year was pretty close to that date. I think it might have been the week before that or something like that. So that's a requirement under the Financial Management Act as well. In recent years, we've had supplementary appropriations that go along with that, but there's no need for a budget review to have a supplementary appropriation. It's meant to be an update, at bare minimum, meant to be an update of fiscal and economic conditions for the Territory. But as I said, recently it has tended to be associated with a supplementary appropriation, which gives funding mid-year for certain priorities of government. The Financial Management Act actually allows for as many appropriation bills as the government would like to introduce, but again, it has to be supported by the information we talked about at the start under sections 10 and 11 of the Financial Management Act. So working backwards from that late June date and noting we've got the budget review in February, what tends to happen is that ministers get authority to bring forward business cases for the following budget, typically late in the calendar year. So we'll start the process for briefing the Treasurer and the Chief Minister on what those proposals might look like. And I guess this is a question often asked about community consultation and community submissions. We'll talk a little bit more about the consultation process a bit later, but in the ACT, I think we're unique that we have year-round submissions, so you can put in a submission anytime you like. I have talked to organisations that for many years have put in a submission a week before budget's released, and that's going to do them not a lot of good because it'll feed into the next year's budget, but it doesn't help to because by that point the budget is basically locked down, well and truly. But if you want to start thinking about if you've got submissions that you'd like to make into the budget process, it's sort of late in the calendar year, sort of getting into October, November, that it probably would have the most impact, because then it'll start. Submissions are provided to agencies who then brief their ministers and say, well, these are the concerns of the community and these are the sort of things they're focusing on. There's a better chance of that feeding into the business case process that will then potentially result in a decision, an initiative in the budget. So that process basically from late in the calendar year, agencies will be working on those business cases they want to bring forward. They must be, sorry, my language wasn't very good there. It's not the agencies that bring forward the business cases, it's the minister, responsible minister. Agencies will develop them, they'll brief the minister. The minister will make comments, agree, disagree, whatever. But ultimately, it's the minister that brings those business cases forward. And normally that, for a June budget, that sort of process starts in early March. This year, I think it ran through March and pretty much up to the end of April. So you've got that approximately 2-month period where ERC will sit pretty regularly. I think we might have had 13 or 14 ERC meetings for this budget. Sometimes there are 40 or more items under consideration. My team in Treasury, but also the team that looks at revenue as well, which is not with my group, but they will provide Treasury briefs on those business cases. And it might be that something is a very good idea, but in the current fiscal climate, when we talked about that at the last session, but with the health funding pressures we've had in the ACT, it makes it difficult to increase expenditure by a lot. So basically, it's that process of briefing on whether and it is a Treasury product. So we don't. This is our view. It helps through the contestable sort of policy making process. It provides a different lens sometimes to the minister. Sometimes it'll be support. It'll be support the proposal because we see merits in it, and we think, given the fiscal situation, it makes sense to do. But those Treasury briefs will be submitted along with the business case for ERC consideration, and that's the discussion that goes through those meetings in March and April. I think I've probably covered off on some of these things, but what do we? So Treasury produces a business case template that is used by all agencies, and it has certain features that must be completed. One is a table that sets out the financial impacts, and again, based on the accrual counting standards we use in the ACT. It must include what the preferred solution is and why it will achieve the outcomes you think it's going to achieve. Sometimes ministers will have a preferred solution and other solutions as well, and it may be they want ERC to consider. So maybe the preferred solution is more expensive than one that's might achieve a lot of what the preferred solution would, but doesn't quite, in the minister's view, get you all the way there. There's a section that talks about how you collaborate across government or with peak groups or community organisations. So it's very important that the collaboration piece is reflected in that. So if you put a submission in that has influenced a particular business case, that should be reflected in that business case as the consultation that has occurred. The risks, which could be financial risks or implementation risks or potentially reputational risks to government, they should be articulated as well. And the evaluation of how you're going to work out how you're going to measure whether the proposal has succeeded or not. So some sort of thinking about how you'll measure success from the particular process. The other thing it must also include is a wellbeing impact assessment, and there's a separate template that is linked to the business case on that. I think this is the 6th year now that we've had these wellbeing impact assessments, and the ACT was the first jurisdiction in Australia that moved towards wellbeing budgeting. I think New Zealand might have started their wellbeing impact assessment process a little bit earlier than the ACT, but in Australia we're the first jurisdiction. And that wellbeing framework is anchored around 12 wellbeing domains, and you can see them now. I won't read through them all, but they're pretty self-explanatory, I think. If you go to the Budget Outlook, and again, this is online, so you can download this if you haven't already, the wellbeing chapter that talks about improving outcomes for Canberrans includes all the initiative descriptions. That will have a financial impact, a brief description of what is intended to do, but it'll also say which of these wellbeing domains, this initiative, what wellbeing domains this initiative is expected to deliver outcomes against. And that's a copy there of the template that goes along with it. You can see very much this is the wellbeing impact assessment template. You see the sections there. What's your evidence that this is going to achieve something? Measuring outcomes, who is impacted, and quite importantly there, what consultation have you undertaken? And as part of our budget process, there is a requirement to consult with the Indigenous community on proposals which have a disproportionate impact on them, or sort of directly linked to closing the gap outcomes. So there's a fair bit of requirement there to do that consultation. And obviously, the more you consult with people who will be impacted or are delivering the services that you're dealing with in your business case proposal, the more likely you are to be able to develop a well-targeted proposal that minimises the risks around it. This is a little bit about the process for the wellbeing impact assessment process. Again, it's basically that early consultation, that early work within government, but also with community organisations, with the ultimate aim that that's going to be attached to a business case that goes into Expenditure Review Committee of Cabinet for decision making. As part of the Treasury brief process as well, we will call out the sort of major themes of the wellbeing impact assessments. We'll also identify which groups in the community are particularly expected to be impacted by a proposal. The other thing that happens at the start of the budget process as well is that we have wellbeing discussion groups, which are volunteers from across government. Quite a few people, I think well over 100, sort of participate in these groups, and they assess the wellbeing impact assessment. So they basically come together and they talk about, and this is bringing together expertise from across the Australian, ACT Public Service. Basically assess how well it has identified the wellbeing impact. And obviously that's something that's a work in progress. Every year I think the quality of these improve as the understanding of what's required to be put in a wellbeing impact assessment is understood more across government. I might pause there and see if there's any questions before I move on to sort of talking about what we did through the last budget. Okay, sorry. What is the purpose of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander budget statement? That's a really good question. We'll come to something on that later. But effectively, as I said before, the budget's an important way of transmitting information to the public. And the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander budget statement is put together by the Aboriginal Service Delivery branch in the new Health and Community Services Directorate, as well as by the Office of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Affairs. And it's basically meant to set out highlights, I guess, for funding for the community. So this year's statement, I think we did a better job potentially of providing information on funding to ACOs. and we're hoping to sort of do a bit more next year in consultation with those branches inside government. I think the other question was about whether business cases are similar to NPPs in the Commonwealth, and absolutely, they're basically the same thing, just a different name. I think the last question was, could a business case be rejected because I forget the wording, maybe the wellbeing impact assessment was not correct. Sorry, let me see if I can read that question. Due to wellbeing impact being inadequate or other factors prioritised, there's not an example where we would regard a wellbeing impact assessment as inadequate. I think that process, the earlier process, the wellbeing discussion groups are meant to improve wellbeing impact assessments if they don't quite meet the grade. It's another piece of decision making for government. So what we try and encourage, and this is not my team, it's in our policy and cabinet decision, Peter Robertson and Robert Gotts, who you might have talked to before, they head up that team. They do a lot of work with agencies to try and make sure the quality is there. It's an information piece, so nothing would be rejected on the basis that the wellbeing impact assessment was not adequate, but it feeds into the information that the ERC considers in terms of making its decisions. Other business case template and wellbeing impact assessment publicly available. Wellbeing impact assessment definitely is. I'm not sure about the business case template. I could probably come back to Leanne on that and let you know. I think it might be. I don't think there's any reason why it couldn't be, but it is originally a cabinet document, so potentially it may still be defined as a cabinet document once it goes through cabinet. Yeah, so definitely the wellbeing impact assessment is available, and as I said before, the business case template, basically it's a financial table, but it goes through those categories of what is the impact, who is impacted, what consultation have you done, what are the risks, and how do you measure success. All right, so I might just go back. How does closing the gap in the commitments to those feed into the budget process? That's a really good question. So sorry, question is, how does closing the gap in the commitments ACT government has made to that and to the ATSEB agreement fed into the budget process? That's explicitly in the wellbeing impact assessment. So if you go back to the slide I had before, you'll see there's impacts on the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. There's a requirement to consult with the community if it's a proposal that goes to one of the outcomes under the agreements. It's also embedded in the budget process rules that consultation has to occur. So it's facilitated, as I mentioned before, by the Aboriginal Service Delivery Branch in what is now the Health and Community Services Directorate. But that sort of consultation has to occur as part of the process. That's reflected in the business case, in the wellbeing impact assessment, and in the business cases that go to government. Sorry, another question is, are community sector organisations required to put in business cases in addition? No. So business cases are not for community organisations. They're for the ministers to bring forward, and their agencies draft those. So the community, your community budget submissions may be an input into the business case, but the business case itself is something that's drafted internal to government. Sorry, Deb from my team has put something in the chat that the business case template is not publicly available, but the business case template for capital projects is. All right, we might. Who's the best person to engage with in a directorate to discuss a budget proposal? Well, hopefully you've got someone that you're talking to on a regular basis. It will depend on, obviously, directorates span a broad range of policy responsibilities. So whoever your contact is, I would imagine in that directorate, it doesn't particularly matter as long as you've got a point of contact you can go into or talk to. All right, we might get back to the presentation. There's not much more to go. So just in terms of, I guess, focusing in on what was delivered in the 25-26 budget. The budget consultation process, as I sort of flagged before, there's sort of three prongs to it. There's the community submission process. There's a Your Say survey that gets conducted between about 4 weeks, I think, in February and March. I think I've got some details here in a minute. And also the roundtable sessions that some of you may have attended in February this year. So again, those roundtable submissions are meant to be an opportunity for people to come with their community submissions, budget community submissions, and talk to those. And I guess the reason we have them in February is that it's post-budget review, so you have a bit of context for what the fiscal pressures or the fiscal settings, I guess, the government is facing in the budget. So this year, obviously, we had that $1 billion cost pressure across 4 years for health. So that was something that obviously set a very important marker for the government in how it's going to deliver the budget. This is our budget consultation website. You can go online now and have a look at that. What the team has actually put together a report on what was heard through those surveys and through the budget submission process. That will be published later this month on this website. And you can go online and see submissions where they were provided to us on a basis that could be released publicly. We do get confidential submissions that we don't release for because of sensitivities that the author has identified. There's a few more details there about the outcomes from the consultation process there. Probably not a lot of surprise in the key priority areas that people identified, and I guess the breadth of those as well. Just see if there's any questions in the chat. Yeah, so it seems if closing the gap and APSA agreements are just including the wellbeing impact assessment, there's no guarantee these commitments would be honoured. Well, I mean, I guess that is part of the government decision-making process. So that will be something ERC considers. But the fact that they've been identified as closing the gap and ATSEB agreement priorities is something the government, the fact that we're in the wellbeing impact assessment, the consultation has to have occurred with the community, is information the government can use in making their decisions through the budget process. That there's no guarantee that any business case will necessarily get up, but it's up to Expenditure Review Committee government to make those decisions. We covered some of this in the earlier session we did on reading the budget, but so I won't dwell on it too much. But for our purposes, I guess it's really that the budget outlook that contains most of the details that people here would be interested in. As I said, they're online, so you can go and look at that or download them. Someone mentioned earlier the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander budget statement and women's budget statement that are available online. There's also a housing statement, a cost of living statement as well that gives housing statement, obviously name speaks for itself, provides more information on government initiatives in that space, and the cost of living statement, as the name suggests, it talks about impacts from cost of living pressures on the community, but also what initiatives the government has brought in to deal with those. These are just other parts of the budget as well. Where our money goes ring is something you would have seen in your rates bill. We talked about this a little bit earlier as well, our fiscal position going from pretty significant deficit. So that's the line here, the headline net operating balance, projected to come back to surplus in the out years. As I mentioned, operating cash position, again, that's something that some people focus on because it's a measure of what, if you're running a deficit, you're basically borrowing to pay for a current activity. So the goal, as I mentioned, with the fiscal strategy, is the government is forecasting that returning to pretty significant surplus by 28-29, which means you can use some of that money to fund infrastructure rather than borrowing all the infrastructure money you need. A little bit of context there, I guess, in terms of where we sit relative to other jurisdictions in terms of debt as a proportion of our income. You can see there we're sort of at the middle of the pack. Western Australia Western Australia with a strong minerals, royalties, revenue, and also favourable GST treatment, setting pretty low. Northern Territory at the top there. Down here we have the credit ratings. We're currently at a AA+, which puts us with the majority of jurisdictions in the country. Let's check questions again. No more. Okay. I mentioned previously in the budget outlook, you can look that up to read all the initiatives, which are the government decisions for that budget. And again, they're grouped by wellbeing, but we'll also group them by the agency delivering them, so you have an idea of who the lead agency is. And then that gets us to the end, and there's a feedback. I'll provide these slides to Leanne later, but there's a feedback link there that you can provide your feedback on. That's pretty much it for the presentation. I'm happy to take any questions, either in the chat or if people want to shout them out, that's fine. Someone will come through in the chat. Is the ACT considering assessing second round of fiscal effects in the future, similar to Victoria's EIF program? I'm not sure what the Victorian program is, but generally fiscal second round effects aren't considered as part of the financial impacts, which I think is what the question's asking. But they can be brought in if you're looking at the broader impacts. You can bring them into the budget business case and explain them basically, and it's the same in the Commonwealth as well. So while and the reason that you don't take them into account when assessing the financial impacts is they're very difficult to measure, and where do you stop in terms of second round effects? But you definitely can call them out in the business case, and people do. So it was part of the government decision-making process. And then, sorry, are there household impact scenarios only produced at the end of the budget process, or they are looked at earlier to determine the impact of, sorry, just going to read as the questions keep coming through, determine the impact of the proposed taxes, fees and concessions on different. Well, certainly, I mean, there is a requirement, as I said before, to include a cost of living impact statement in the budget. But in developing business cases, scenarios are often used to evaluate what the impact would be on particular cohorts in the community. So that, again, would be, there's opportunities to put that in the business case. And the other team here in Treasury that looks after the revenue side often do some work on that. Is there any socio-economic analysis of groups who are low income or have other problems that might justify stronger support in the budget? I'm not sure if that question is referring to do we report in the budget or do we consider it through the budget decision-making process? But certainly that is the sort of information you expect to see in a wellbeing impact assessment and in a business case that goes to ERC for decision-making. And sorry, Jenny, you've got your hand up.
Thanks, Scott, and thanks for your presentation. Yeah, I just had a quick question around the submissions that the community sector usually puts in as part of the budget process. And it was really helpful to hear from you about the timing for those submissions to be most impactful and the considerations. But I think it might be helpful if you could talk us through some of the things that we can do to tailor our submissions so that they might be more impactful, and sort of some of the things that government looks at when they're reading through those. Yeah,
no, that's a really good question, Jenny. Thank you. First point to note is they're not coming to Treasury. We physically receive them and we provide them to the agencies for which they're most relevant. But I think really having an evidence base is really important, who it's going to impact and how it's going to impact. I think what is often useful as well is if there's any other proposals or any existing programs that do what this proposal is seeking to do. So it might call on existing programs in the community. I think having an idea of costs would potentially help as well. The cost to the sector and delivering a service, if that's what the submission is talking about. and particularly in the fiscal situation the Territory is in the moment, whether there's options to scale a proposal, whether something could be delivered as a pilot is often a good thing as well if it's new, and evaluated to see if that works. But it's really going through those things I talked about before with the wellbeing impact assessments and the business case. Like, what is the evidence this will have an impact? What is the argument for government getting involved in the first place? And what kind of risks could be involved in delivering the proposal?
Great, thank you.
Can I ask a question, please?
Yep, sure. Yeah.
Yeah. As you know, there's been a report about the high rates of Aboriginal incarceration in the ACT, and the challenge to reduce those requires different departments to collaborate together. And I mean, it's quite a complex question, in fact, and quite a range of different departments, different services will be required. Is there any way of making, or, you know, of government ministries, directorates coming together to actually sit down together to work through how each of them could, in their own ways, contribute to reducing that problem, which is really an embarrassment to this jurisdiction, I think?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think through the budget process, agencies are meant to collaborate. So if there'll normally be a lead minister. So in the case of incarcerations, the Minister for Corrective Services would be the lead, but there would also be a supporting minister across those other directorates as well. So that's how it's supposed to work. And I think the commissioning process, I think there was a big step up in getting agencies to talk to each other, collaborate, and talk to the sector as well. So ideally, that's how the situation should work. When it comes to a business case, there is a requirement to consult with all agencies who might be involved in delivering that proposal. So it should be picked up through that. Also, when Treasury briefs on it, if we think there's other agencies who haven't been consulted or haven't been included in the business case, that's something we'll talk to those agencies about as well. So it's probably not perfect, but it is something we've been working on. I think it's really important, particularly when you talk about some of these really complex social issues.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Okay, are there any more questions before we wrap up today? No, okay. Well, thank you, Scott, for that really great presentation. I hope everyone online gained some new knowledge about the ACT budget process. If you can, please do the evaluation so we can look to improve these sessions. If you would like to build on your practical skills, ACOS is hosting a ACT budget workshop, which will go through the processes of how to write a budget submission and other useful skills. That's on our website, so you can have a look at that and register for that. We also have an information session for next month on working with vulnerable people card changes. That is also detailed on our website if you are interested. Yeah, I think that's all from me. Thank you again, Scott, for that great presentation. It was very informative.
Thanks, Leanne. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
All right. Thank you.
Bye.
Okay, bye.
Bye.